The worst question to ask before we begin a show. Are you ready?
Are you ready?
The
No.
answer is no. Is it okay that I'm not ready? Yes. Today, Bambos, the one thing we
This
kind
is
of
episode 200.
this is episode 200. Yeah.
And it's probably I find it one of the most important episodes we've ever done.
I find it the most important episode we've ever done. This episode has made me emotional. It's made me angry. It's made me feel like, why am I doing this to myself? Because in some weird way, it's like it's easier to put your head in the sand when issues like this come up.
Yeah.
And Noor Eleshi,
E.
E.
Ilashi.
Eleshi, you pronounce better than I do because you're near to her country. She trusted us to take the journey with her, and we're going to discuss her father's imprisonment. He was part of the Holy Land Foundation, which was named the Holy Land Five, which was a group of people that were sought out and, I would say, persecuted by the U.S. government for doing incredibly beautiful work in the world. And that he was in prison in 2007 in April. So this is the anniversary month. And we're going to discuss with Noor that journey and where she is now, and how she keeps the hope going. Yeah. And we're going to do that
on a wonderful chaos, Andy.
A wonderful chaos. Yes, Bambos. There's shows like this that we take on where, we've had people that have been raped, that have been molested. And interestingly, those were hard subjects to hold space for.
Yeah.
But I notice for me, when I have to hold injustice, and especially when that injustice is going on in the moment that I'm also present, it's really hard. I don't know why. It's easier to sit with somebody when they've actually gone through a trauma that we can hold space for. But when it's an injustice, then it feels totally different.
Yeah. I can't put words to that.
Yeah.
I completely resonate with that.
And Noor, I know her because Noor wrote the article for my first book for Buzzworthy. So Noor wrote the book basically for Buzzworthy. Yeah. And for the Last Letter book, as you know. So that's how we met. And then I saw her post something. It would have been maybe even a year ago concerning this situation. And I forgot about it. And then I invited her to join, not even knowing any of the real story. And then she said to me, Andy, I don't know if you know what you're asking me. Like she's lived through years and years and years of sharing this story in universities across America, and just having anyone listen. And I think what I gathered was she took a pause from that because it took such a toll on her life. So for me to invite her to share the space with us was really inviting her to come back to things that she had left a bit behind.
Yeah.
So in that way, I'm really grateful for her to trust us in this journey with her.
Yeah.
So I'd say
bring her on.
It would be great to bring her on. Yeah. Hello.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfect.
Okay.
Welcome.
When I was walking today, because I walk every day, and meditating around like where I wanted our show to begin, and this show was like, I thought of your dad, and I have to tell you, when I think of him, it really makes me want to cry. It's hard for me to sit with what I can only imagine is the helplessness that you're feeling. And I can't imagine. I if I just touch it in myself, it begins to, it feels stupid to ask you questions. That's how it feels. And I see Bambus is already going, I'm already halfway there. So the thing I actually thought it would be beautiful is just to have like a minute of silence, just to acknowledge that your dad is sitting in years of that same silence. and to share the gratitude, because in a way, this man who's actually was trying to do incredibly great, loving work in the world is now being persecuted for that. And there's something that's incredible about that, which makes his life full of so much meaning, even though it's hard to see and experience that. So I just want to spend a minute of just silence and allow us to share that together before we start. Yeah. Hmm.
I'm probably not going to be able to talk for this show.
Yeah.
No, let's all have a beautiful conversation for sure.
In 2007, your dad is taken away from you. Like, how is it for you to live with the feeling that you are in America, this country which has hope and opportunity, and then you see this injustice that occurs? Like, how do you reconcile that in your life?
Yeah, so I definitely have a very complex relationship with America, my country of birth, um, my native land, the only home I ever knew, because this was a land that my father came to, like back in the 70s, and made into his home after years of feeling displaced. My father is a Palestinian refugee, and basically his mom lost her home in 48. And after the Holocaust, there were families that moved into a bunch of Palestinian homes, definitely basically creating this cycle of homelessness and oppression. And my grandma was one of the women who ended up into a refugee, and that kind of continued the cycle into my father's life. He lived all over Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and he lived in boarding schools, and then finally, they made their way to America, and it was a beautiful, hopeful moment. And he married my mom in the 80s, and they moved here, and I was born in the mid 80s, and it was a really, I mean, I had an absolutely gorgeous childhood. We went to Disneyland, and we did it all, and it wasn't until the 90s that I started to feel this hostility.
Mm.
My family is Muslim, and my mother covers, and the ironic part is they were very excited to move here because the Middle East did not allow freely the practicing of like religions. There was so much chaos happening, like
Mm.
in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that a lot of like Muslim families came to America because they knew they could practice their religion freely here. And so, my parents were very hopeful. They were very excited. And when my dad came, and in the 90s, when we really started to hear mostly a lot of like pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli lobby groups speaking of basically the charity that he started, the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development, as if it was, some kind of like conspiring funding, for like designated terrorist groups. It was a huge shock for me. And so, yeah, we started feeling it in the early 90s. And then, of course, he was arrested in 2000, like a few, well, his charity was shut down in 2001, and he was arrested in 2004. So right around the millennium era and right around 9/11, he became like collateral damage to, what had happened. And basically, this is the other side of that story. Like, I'm all, very sympathetic for those who lost families during 9/11.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there was this whole other side to that story of people who became collateral damage.
Yeah, that was the same word that I thought of the whole time, was collateral damage. In fact, I didn't remember the word at first. I'm like, what's that damage word? What's the and the thing that fascinated me, and we talk about it a lot on the show, is that when people have fear, they give up so many rights and their rational thinking decreases. So the one thing that that didn't surprise me was that your father's foundation was praised, and the same organizations he was giving money to, U.S. organizations were giving money to. They just weren't Muslim organizations.
Right, exactly.
And the hardest thing for me to see is that if any logical individual were to look at this case, just using rationale, just using numbers, like logic, like if we're giving to a foundation and American organizations are giving to that same foundation, then why would we designate one and not another as a terrorist enabler, right? It's the only difference is one happens to be run by a Muslim group and the other one is just a generic USaid group. So in some weird way, that sat with me ever since watching these two documentaries.
Yeah, and it came up during the trials. The defense attorneys definitely mentioned that several times, that that was and remains our greatest defense, that the USAID, an American government organization, was giving to the same exact distribution centers in Palestine that the Holy Land Foundation was giving money to, and food and medicine and basic humanitarian aid. The main difference is that, my father and actually four other men who were called the Holy Land Five, they all are, they're Palestinian, they're Muslim. And so that was the difference. And so the government attorneys, the prosecutors said, well, they must have known, while the American government agencies had no idea. And the funny part is, even throughout the trials and even after the trials, the USAID and the American government continued to give charity to those same distribution centers.
Yeah. Which, as I saw, and I kept reading, which were also designated by the US government to be okay to give money to.
Oh, yeah. So the actual Zakat committees, which literally means like, Zakat means donations, or like the act of giving. These charities or these distribution centers, not one of them were ever, and until this day, ever put on OFAC's designated terrorist list.
Yeah.
So that's, again, another huge defense for us.
Yeah. And I mean, sorry.
So what you're telling us is they must have known, like those words just stay in my mind. They must have known. So it's an assumption.
It's absolutely an assumption. Yeah, they must have known. They must have known. And I sat through both trials. Like, I was a budding journalist at the time. I was like, I'm going to work for the New York Times. I was like on my way to like applying to a few master's programs. I got into the New School in New York City. I got like a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. I got into it because I wrote so much about this father-daughter memoir that I was working on. And, it's definitely really funny the way it all played out. But
yeah, and I think the humor, the absurdity that's really that I've been struggling with is that even the people that were the prosecutors don't deny that there was no association between what your father was doing and terrorism. It's all inferred, because in helping the children and the disabled and those that don't have enough food, there is the implicit idea that there is also support of course, Hamas, which has been designated as a terrorist organization. But there is no direct link, which is it's the craziest thing, because if we went through life and I said, every time I go to a dinner party, if everyone in that party is someone that I'm now guilty for all of their sins, I couldn't go out. I mean, there is
Right.
no surviving in the world if you're held accountable for something that has absolutely nothing to do with you.
Right. And that stemmed from the material support law, which was basically strengthened after 9/11 through the Patriot Act,
Yeah.
which basically made it illegal to give material support in the form of humanitarian aid and then make these like convoluted charges, these trumped up charges, and make it okay to go to court with that. It's
Yeah.
also just really important to note that the Holy Land Foundation was tried here in Texas, which is where I'm based now, in Dallas, Texas, which was a pretty tough crowd, and right after 9/11.
And
But
the president is Bush at that time, who's
right,
already
who
said on TV that these people are guilty. So you've already got a horrible,
right,
yeah,
guilty before proven innocent, for
yeah,
sure. This was a classic example. But even with all of that, there were actually two trials, and the first trial ended in a hung jury, which is very, very important to note. And this is kind of a little bit of a sidetrack, but like the other day, I was watching the Playboy Enterprise documentary, which is pretty fascinating, and it goes into Hugh Hefner and how he did a lot of political work around censorship, which, as you may know, through his work around nudity and everything.
yeah,
But one of the things that I found fascinating is he was put in a full length trial, and by the end of that trial, there was a hung jury, which is literally what happened in my father's case.
yeah,
Now, the difference between that case and this case, well, there's a lot of differences, but the main difference is that once there's a hung jury, when basically what it means is when the jury deliberates for like 2-3 weeks and they don't come up with a unanimous verdict, what ends up happening is the charges then are dropped, and there's nobody who then attempts to retry the case. In our case, it was that after the hung jury, it was actually a deliberation of almost, yeah, like 2.5 to 3 weeks. The jury went in, they talked about it. There was a split decision. There were, like, I would say probably 80 to 90% who thought this was basically a complete BS case. And
wow,
then there were people in there who kept saying, no, like, these people are guilty. Like, Ghassan is guilty. And when they were asked, like, well, why do you have the evidence? They were like, no, we have a feeling, like they're and they could never really show why they thought they were guilty. So unfortunately, the next year, which was around 2008, they retried the case. And that's when, unfortunately, I just sat there after two full length trials. And basically, it was one of the most shocking moments of my life. Like, my heart just dropped to the floor. And hearing the judge basically read one guilty, verdict after the next, I was just devastated.
like how, like, take me to that moment. Like, there's moments in my life when everything goes like quiet. It's almost like I can't hear. Like the shock is that deep. I have to imagine that was what it would have been like for you at that moment.
Yeah, I have to say, like, it was such an emotional roller coaster in that moment. Like, the first thing was shock. It was like basically just being completely speechless for like a few minutes. And then it was just absolute rage. Like, I felt a lot of anger
Mm,
and rage. And then I felt like, that I needed to be strong for my family. I was the eldest. I am the eldest of six. And I knew that, I had kind of become like the spokesperson for our family. I was the journalist, I was the one with the writing degree. I was the one who had done a lot of media training, and I knew that this was the moment for me to just put on this strong face. And I still remember, like, of course, I didn't shed a tear in the courtroom. I was just angry, and I
mm,
walked. There was a moment where, like, all the families said their goodbyes because this was going to be the last time They were going to have their fathers like be able to go home and make brunch for them, and just be amongst them. And that was a heartbreaking moment to witness. I took myself out of the picture, and I just started to really empathize and sympathize with everybody there and hold
Mm.
space. And then the minute I walked out of that courtroom, of course, like 30 journalists just like with a mic in my face, like already expecting at that point that I would have something to say.
Yeah.
And I vocalized like the huge like injustice that had just taken place. And I had a very strong feeling that this was going to be, because he was sentenced to 65 years in prison, and I had a strong feeling that this was going to be a long journey.
Can you imagine
Before,
that? Can we slow down a moment? 65 years for
yeah,
trying to help children in need. I want everyone to hear and like
I know. I
process
always
that.
say it as a footnote, like 65 years. We're like, wait,
Like,
hold on, pause.
like
Did you just say
there's
65?
murderers that spend less time in prison than your dad for doing charitable work that had no association at all with terrorism. We call it had a connection in some weird regard, but 65 years, it's incomprehensible.
Yeah, exactly. It really is. Yeah, that was a whole other thing. It's like that 65-year sentence definitely just like was a dagger to my heart. It was, yeah, I couldn't fathom it. It was beyond comprehension. And it was right around the time I got into a Master of Fine Arts degree program in New
Mhm.
York. And at that point, I was just depleted.
Yeah.
I felt, I had spent the past, few years of my life speaking for his innocence. And, I had like my mother, who was now, basically alone with these like 5 siblings of mine. My brothers at the time were, 11, 12, 13 years old, like young, tweens and teenagers. And my sister's also pretty young. And I did what the only thing I knew how to do at that point. Like I ran. And I know, Andy, you know about that.
Yeah, I know.
You've been traveling for
I escaped my
the
pain
past,
for 20
right.
years. I escaped my pain. Yeah.
I ran. I went to New York, and I
Mm,
felt very guilty about it, but
mm,
I ran. I ran, and I wanted to be there for my family. And I just had taken on so much at such a young age. I was in
yeah.
my early 20s at the time, and I knew not I didn't know what to do but just take some space from the whole thing. I was like,
Yeah.
well, there's nothing I can do at this point. They've sentenced him to 65 years.
Yeah. And when did it turn that you started to speak at universities? Because I mean, you've been to Harvard, Columbia, Yale. I mean, you've gone through all the biggies, and those
Right.
biggies don't invite just people that have nothing to say. So how was it that all of a sudden you at least switched into, I'm going to be a voice and an ambassador in these platforms?
Right. So something beautiful about New York is it opened up a world for me, because in Dallas, while I was living here, I was mainly just doing like local channels, and throughout the trials, the attorneys were very much against, like as attorneys are, they were against any of the family members speaking out, because they said that you can incriminate your father with the slightest word, with the slightest sentence. You could say something that could somehow like be twisted in the media, and then like it would support him in being even more punished. And I was like,
Yeah.
well, what's worse than 65 years at this point? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
so
What more
like
do we have to lose right now?
I'm like,
Yeah.
dude, I'm in New York. So yeah, the first time I ever got invited was at Yale, and I had met these Columbia University students, which I had actually spoken at Columbia University, but it did launch this like beautiful like couple-year tour with all the law clinics at all the Ivy League schools. It was mainly through word of mouth, and a lot of the students at these law clinics were just very passionate about this case. I mean, this case, the Holy Land Foundation case, was being used as one of the most absurd, cases, the way that the law was being used against American citizens. It was definitely being
Yeah.
used as a study case, basically. So
Yeah, you'd have to. I still can't
Mhm.
understand why there's no Netflix series about this.
Yeah,
Because
that's in the works. Like, I'm definitely, and this is why I love this platform, because if anybody out there is watching this, or if anybody out there shares this, and somebody out there feels, obliged or inspired to support in creating a more mainstream docu-series about this, like the Playboy Enterprise that I was
yeah.
watching, but this is, I know it's
You know
so
you
like
know
such a different
You know what I was telling my
subject,
my
but
wife though, which is really frustrating, is that everybody gets their moment in the sun. Everybody gets their moment of like McCarthyism. We knew it took us years to look back at how everyone was vilified as having any association with communism. Like that took us years to like grow and say, "Oh, how bad were we then?" As if the same thing isn't happening now. So,
and the ironic part about that is my father was a huge advocate for like the, like basically I grew up listening to Nelson Mandela speeches.
yeah.
I grew up like he was always the heart of like he had a heart of justice. If there was anything that he could not tolerate in the world, like he was such a man of action, very little
Mm,
words, very quiet, but what would get his face red, like that face that you see behind you, it
mm,
would get bloodshot red. Like what would get his face red was just reading stories of injustice. So we grew up listening to like the German, the Irish, the Japanese persecution,
yeah.
the stories of the Japanese internment during World War II. And like basically it wasn't until 40 years later in the 80s that like the president and like the American government publicly apologized for all of the Japanese families who had gone through that.
Yeah.
And so what I continued to say at that point was I really hope it doesn't take like 4 decades
Yeah.
for like
For the
the
apology to come.
Islamophobia, yeah,
Yeah.
and the Islamophobia and like the kind of like all these sentiments that grew after 9/11 that were kind of
Yeah.
anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, to finally say like this, whatever happened that day wasn't connected to 99% of,
Mm.
Arabs and Muslims in the world. And to
Yeah.
say that we are all one and that we can't separate and it's all an illusion.
Yeah, but after 9/11, I mean, if you do the timetable of when all this went down, it was 2001. That was exactly when Bush put the Patriot Act and extended all of these sort of material, and I can't remember the word you used
The
earlier,
material support law.
the material support law. So in some weird way, through the fear, anxiety, and then add the Islamophobia, then all of a sudden you've got the perfect recipe for people to lose their comprehension. And
Right.
it's I wanted to move to the second trial for a moment because we got through the first one, but the thing that got me really, there were levels of anger as I watched the documentary. First thing, I saw that there were only 20,000 people that had viewed that documentary, which already was like, so one of the biggest injustices going on in the US at this moment, and it hasn't got the exposure that I imagined it would warrant. That was the first thing, utterly shocked me. And then from there, I walked to that in that second trial, the lawyer said they tried to find the dumbest jurors. They intentionally knew that if they found people that didn't think critically, that they could show them imagery of Hamas is terrorist acts, which we all agree are horrible. And
Right.
then
Absolutely. And had nothing to do with my father.
had nothing to do with your dad, but show them bloody, gory images over and over again, and then say material support, material support. And then what is it? We don't actually have any, but we have a guy from Israel that we bring over that sort of he could have made up information because he's working as an informant for the Israelis. So
Yeah, he was the first, it was the first time in American history where like somebody was allowed to testify with a pseudonym. And
yeah,
testifying with a pseudonym basically completely counteracts the whole point
of
of
having
cross-examination.
a free and fair
Yeah,
trial.
a free and fair trial. When you cross-examine a witness, you need to know who they are, what their name is, what their background is. If you don't have that information, it completely limits you from being able to, have a free and fair
Yeah,
trial and
and that's agreed
properly
that
cross-examine.
that person was working for the Israeli government, which was acknowledged. So the Israeli government, the
Intelligence agency.
who's trying to undermine anything that supports Palestine. So
Right.
his agenda is not being honest. His agenda is actually to lie in favor of what supports the Israeli view of the world, which is so sickening.
Right, right.
It is.
Yeah. And I do want to make a clarification too here. It's more like the Zionist view, like the view that believes that like that area is just a Jewish state and has
Mhm.
slowly over the years infiltrated that whole land, which in 1948, before that was, pretty much a beautiful piece of land that was peacefully like Jews, Muslims, and because it is such an epicenter of all of the religions, and
Mm,
people lived peacefully alongside each other for thousands of years. It's such a myth that like this is an area that's been war torn. No, like for thousands of years, this area was at peace, and
mm,
Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived peacefully there. And what was funny, even though they would show all these photos of suicide bombings, which were completely irrelevant when it came to actually giving the history of that piece of land, it was not admissible. Again and again, the judge and the prosecution would object against telling the history of that area, which I think is very crucial to telling the story and arguing this case, but
mm,
continued over and over again to completely reject this type of evidence, deeming it as irrelevant. So it
mm.
was a very one-sided case, and we did not get a fair trial.
Well,
And the
I wanted
bottom,
to add to that, by the way, because this is what I took away, which felt even worse than what you just said, is that your dad wasn't allowed to show the charity that he was doing. So
right,
not only were they forced to see the ravages of what Hamas was doing, we had no association with them, but
absolutely
they could
not.
not show the charity work. They couldn't show the little kids and the people in the wheelchairs and the actual hospitals where the money was going. Like the fact that that was not able to, that was inadmissible, it boggles the mind. I don't know how that works.
Right. Yeah. Anyone, I mean, that trial, the second trial was packed. I mean, both were to the brim. Like every bench, like people had to literally sit like this in the courtroom because there
Mm,
were so many people. Some people were standing up. It would almost max out the capacity of the
yeah.
room. And there was not just community members who knew my father, who were, like he was part of like the Mexican immigrant, he was just such a human rights activist. There were people from every group, of people. It was beautiful. He had a variety of supporters. He
Mm,
had American, human rights activists. There were just people from all over who would pack that room, and every single person who was there was in utter shock, moment after moment, to see like how could this even be possible,
yeah.
but like unfortunately, like my father's case is not unique, and that there are so many people after 9/11 who became collateral damage and who were falsely accused, falsely imprisoned, and unfortunately falsely sentenced
Mm.
and into these just very dramatic, sentences, and continue to be there until this day.
Yeah, it feels like someone had to take the blame.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
can I ask your father in this moment, like, how is he?
Yeah, yeah, that's a
Are you
great
able to,
question.
are you able to see him?
Yeah, so the last time I ever saw my father was literally like 3 weeks before they shut down the world for this
Mm,
pandemic. So it was in March, kind of early March of 2019, or sorry, 2020. That was the year. And I had gone with my sister, and she was pregnant with my nephew at the time. And so he got to see my sister pregnant, which was nice. He was so happy that this was going to be his second grandbaby. And it was a beautiful visit. You know, they only let us, they put this box, like this taped box around every visitor group, and they let us stay within that taped box. We can hug him for only a few seconds, and then we have to sit across from each other. So he's on a row and we're on a row. And it was beautiful to be able to see him and connect and everything. But yeah, we haven't actually seen him since then, because I even like got married in the middle of a pandemic. And my husband got to meet him through the phone and everything, but because all the visitations were pretty much shut down until the vaccinations came out, we haven't been able to see him. And now we just literally heard in the past like maybe 2 weeks that the visitations have opened up again, but get this, for 1 hour behind the glass. And so my father, being who he is, was like, it is not worth it for you guys to get flights, rent a hotel room, rent a car, so that you can see me for 1 hour behind glass. No, thank you. Like, let's wait until, but that's such a true like representation of who he is. Like from the moment that he entered, and I do want to share what he said on sentencing day here in a little bit. From the moment that he entered prison, he was at peace. You know, he had many chances to just plead guilty for the sake of like the American government and the prosecution feeling like they could be right. But he said there's nothing on this planet that's going to make me plead guilty to feeding like hungry orphans and supporting people in need. This was a very like, I'm very proud of those actions. And we were like, well, Dad, it's okay, you know, you could, but he's just he has such a strong resolve in what he believes in. And you know, even, you know, he could be the type of father that could be miserable, that could be sad, that could be just in this depressive state. And yet he is our greatest driving force. He is like, you know, my brothers, who again were teenagers at the time, I always say, like, if it weren't for what happened with my father, they wouldn't be where they are today. My brothers are now like serial entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial prodigies, you know, own a few multi-million-dollar companies. And this was all driven by the rage and the anger, as you know, Andy, like, because when I was writing the article about you, like, rage is a very powerful tool and can create that space of success when you allow it to. But he's been such a driving force, and to put it in a nutshell, he is more like physically, he's more mentally, spiritually, and emotionally free than most people I know.
Yeah. We actually had one of our favorite guests. He spent 20 years, or was it 20 or 30 years behind bars. And when he came on, you feel how clear and comfortable he is, how much he had to make peace with. Kenny Johnson is his name. We love Kenny.
Yeah, and it's funny because I always call him like the Palestinian Nelson Mandela, my father.
Yeah, this is exactly. I just wrote on this paper Mandela, and I think it's so ironic that he was listening and sharing Mandela with you as you were a child, and now he is actually living the life of a Mandela in the sense of imprisoned for things that were actually not just.
Right. It was like his subconscious mind was already a part of this, you know, kind of like, you know, I mean, these martyrs that have kind of like, you know, sacrificed their life and their families and everything for years and years and decades in order to create real impact and change and political like shifts in the world, you know?
Yeah. I mean, isn't that amazing if you look at your dad in that light? Because that's how I began to see him as I dug into this, is like, what an incredible man your dad is. Like, he's like the kind of dad I would want to have in my life. As you know, I didn't have a very good relationship with my dad, but someone that I could look up into and respect because they lived a life of principle. And then that's what I took away from your dad and his journey. Like the thing you wrote, I wrote down when we didn't even get into the point when the FBI broke into the house in 2001. But when he looked at you and said, keep your head up high because your father did nothing wrong.
Yeah, like, he did. He managed. Yeah, that moment was a defining moment for me because, you know, the whole thing was a shock. They went to all 5 houses at the same time. It was 7 a.m. we were sleeping, and I was his daughter, like his beloved daughter. Like, he showed me everything. Out of all 6 kids, and they all are very passionate about this, but none of them knew my father like I did. I was the oldest. I was the one that he would take to the charity and show me, like, this is the work that we're doing. I would get on the phone calls and do, like, help and volunteer with infomercials. He would
Yeah.
show me the burn victims who died during phosphorus bombings in Palestine, who would come here, and they would do these reconstructive surgeries on them. I, as an 11-year-old, saw these kids who were burned from head to toe.
Wow.
He showed me so much at such a young age that I became the daughter of a revolutionary. I became
Yeah.
the daughter of a human rights activist. And I am that through my spirit. That is
Yeah.
the greatest. Like, I'm also a DJ, and I'm also, like, I have a lot of multiplicity, but I am, in my essence, like an advocate for oneness and humanity.
Mm.
And so,
But
you
I
know,
want
when
to
he
go.
walked away to the car and I saw him get into that car, I was the only one. I made sure my siblings were still asleep, and I was the only one who ran, out. And at first the FBI stopped me. There was like 30 authorities, FBI, CIA, like, it was like a whole crime scene in front of our house. I ran out, I pushed them out of my way, and I ran out and I said, Baba, 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 in Arabic. And he basically, he stops, and they were going to shove him in the car, and he looks into my eyes and he says, keep your head up high, Baba. He would call me Baba, like, as a term of endearment, like, because your father did nothing wrong. And those words stayed in my heart, like, till this moment. That's what keeps my heart beating.
I want to say what I feel like I want to correct something that you said, which we spoke earlier, is that in a weird way, your dad wasn't a revolutionary, because that would imply that in some ways he was doing something to cause trouble. He actually
Yeah.
he was doing the right thing, and by doing the right thing, he became a revolutionary.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. He was more, when I say that, and there's so many meanings to so many words,
Of
it
course.
was more like, not a revolutionary in that he creates revolt, a revolutionary in that he leads a revolution through his very essence, a
Yes.
revolution for humanitarianism, a revolution for, like, seeing all people as one. And that's what I meant by that.
And there's a reason why I say that, and I think you probably already know that, is because
Yes,
there's people out there that don't want to understand this story. They
right,
actually are hoping that they can take a soundbite out of anything you say, misuse it, miscategorize it, and therefore vilify you even more than you've already been vilified.
right,
So there's a risk in anything you ever do the rest of your life, is
right.
that when people don't really want to look at the facts, they try to sensationalize. And that's one of the things that I'm absolutely just disgusted with in life, is the need of people to validate a belief that they already have without proof. And it
That's
gets
right.
back, get back to what you said in the first trial, when there were two jurors who said, basically, there is no proof that he's guilty. I just feel it, as
Right,
if the fact that he's a Muslim is proof enough. And
right.
that disgusts me to no end.
And one of those jurors actually came to the sentencing, and she started crying during sentencing day, saying, like, I didn't realize by choosing the guilty, like, verdict route, that he would be sentenced to 65 years. Like, even if he was tried in Israel, this would have been like a couple of years type of situation,
Yeah.
because he was never charged with one violent act. It was all, like, very convoluted, conspiracy based, trumped up charges. So it was, yeah. So that was definitely interesting to view her now, kind of sympathetic in that
Yeah.
moment.
I mean, the one thing, because everything has been exhausted in terms of legal recourse. So the really only recourse you have right now is a presidential pardon. Other than that, I
Yeah,
guess there's nothing you can do.
presidential clemency, presidential pardon, presidential commutation, any type of, yeah. And Yeah, and at this point, like we had this whole campaign where it's like, write your senators and this and that, and there's all this stuff. And I got to a point after the years and years of advocating in the Ivy League schools and live television and everything, that I just got into this space of defeat.
Yeah.
And that's where if it's okay with you, I'd love to read a little bit about that in a story that I wrote.
Please do.
Okay, so I said, over the years, I've developed an aversion to deep water. I realize now that it's connected not to fear, but to defeat. After all those years of advocating for my father and hearing no promising news about his release, I started to ask, what's the point? I figured, if I can't win at liberating my father, how can I win at anything in life? Jaded was my way of being, disconnected, complacent, numb. I swam in shallow waters. I played small. I held back. I hid in the shadows. Why would anyone be interested in what I had to say? Was I visible? I know they saw me, but did they really see me? Did they really feel my broken heart shattered into a million little fractals of dust, invisible, out of sight? So you see, I wasn't afraid of deep water. I just didn't believe in my ability to swim far. And even if seahorses, starfish, and dolphins swirled around me with warm delight, I would turn away, disenchanted, uninterested. I would diminish them like I diminished myself. Years of suffering came from the narratives I had whispered to myself, from the false interpretations of endless self-sabotage. But now I see that my pain was self-inflicted. I chose to suffer. I chose defeat. And through my story of not being enough, I chose scarcity. I see now that I matter and that my life is worth living, that by choosing to live, I can inspire others to live. I see now that I am capable. And then I just kind of say, like, no more asking, what's the point? The point is obvious. The entrapment of my father does not have to mean the end of mine. His spirit lives through me. His voice lives through me. He laid the foundation of this strong moral sense of justice. He gave me so much. He passed on his torch of advocacy and harmony, and now I get to create a new legacy. I get to choose connection and abundance. I get to choose possibility over defeat, breakthrough, my evasion to deep water. I get to dive unbound through the depths of the stunning seas, under the silhouettes of stingrays and sea turtles, through the mystical harmonic vibration of whales. I get to truly, fully, powerfully live. So that's just kind of a piece I wrote recently where, like, I had gone through this like moment of defeat, and it truly is like my father who continues to just inspire us to live. He says, I want you to live your life, don't worry about me, I'm good here, like, just continue to be you, continue to reach all your greatest potentials.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for creating the space for me to read it. And I always tear up when I read it because it's just such a journey, like going from there to here. And it's definitely not linear either. Like, there's moments where it comes back and then, so.
And what is that piece actually? What does it mean to you now, that piece?
So, yeah, that piece now, that was probably like where I was, like, in like a couple of years ago. I did a ton of personal development work around this. I was so angry at everything authoritarian, from the cops to the, and I did this leadership training, and there was a New York police officer in my team. And I had this long journey of like, not like, there's so many of you who are amazing, and so many of you who are protectors. And, I just had to really come to this point where, like, I realized, like, I was very traumatized by everything that had happened. And I had really, like, kind of just through that anger created a lot of narratives about myself, about my potential, you know, and now like it's just such a beautiful thing to look back on and see like how far I've come.
That's beautiful. You know, when I sent you the message to ask if you want to do the show, I didn't know any of this. You know that. So you were the first guest who said, Andy, we got to talk. And when you said it, I was like, oh shit, what have I gotten myself into here? And there was something in your voice, which when we hung up the phone, I'd already felt this is going to be the one of the least comfortable interviews I'm going to do, because
Yeah.
it's not only about a healing process, it's about an ongoing injustice.
Right.
And I noticed that's just harder for me to hold space for, because I can feel anger in myself as well, as you just mentioned. So,
right. Yeah. There's still like a stuckness or like a kind of uncertainty, you know, it's like story is not complete, you know. I continue to imagine him, you know, just released one day, like on the beach somewhere in Turkey or something with my mom, just having a brand new, beautiful chapter, you know, my husband and I. It's one of the greatest things where I fell in love rose in love with my husband is when he told me one day that let's meditate for his release. And we did this long, beautiful mantra, and he kept telling me just keep imagining him like walking out, you know. And those are the types of things that I think are very powerful, is like, you know, of course, you know, creating something where it can create that viability, you know. And then also just like the power of meditation and the power of thought, you know. And so we've definitely done a lot of work around that as well. And yeah, we're open to any and all support as a family, like as far as like, you know, any connections, any networking of you know, any like badass lawyers who can swoop through here and say like, I know just what to do. Any like campaign activists, like people. Yeah.
It really sounds like your love for this man has really defined your whole life.
Yeah. My father really, really created like such a safe, loving space for like the divine masculine energy. Like you know, yeah, he was such a beautiful example of what like a divine masculine man gets to be. And so I have that to look up to every day. And my husband is such a beautiful example of that too. And they always say like, fathers, be good to your daughters, because they'll marry a man like you. And that's exactly what happened with me, and I'm so grateful.
I've never
I was going to say, how long is it till he goes to prison?
Oh no!
That
Please
was a
don't
bad
say
joke.
cancel.
It's hard not to see that though. Also, in this face, is he also using his voice in the prison, or is he completely cut off from?
Is he allowed to?
Yeah. So right now, my father only. So he's such an intellectual. It's so funny. Like more than most people out here, he has a subscription to the New Yorker. To like, he literally has a subscription to like every major like literary journal known to man. He has like, you know, he listens to like NPR and a bunch of radio shows, and you know, like he sent me this beautiful just 2 days ago. He only can communicate through phone calls and emails. And so he emailed Dylan and I, my husband and I, he says, there's a beautiful podcast called The Palestinian Table. And it's a woman whose father, I believe, is Christian, and her mother is Muslim, and she lives in Jerusalem, and she talks about like Palestinian cuisine. And it's a beautiful, beautiful like podcast. And I'm like, dude, you're finding things that I don't even find while I'm out here. Like he created a connection while I was at the New School with Dave freaking Eggers, the literary Pulitzer Prize like finalist. And I became friends with Dave Eggers as a result. And I wrote for his literary magazine about my father's case, actually. And a book ended up being published called Patriot Acts. and it has a chapter about my father. And again, like that's my father. Like he's so connected, even though he has he's very well read. You know, his book library in there is massive. You know, he's always having to give away books to make space for new books. So he's still like stimulating his mind. You know, he's definitely like he memorized the whole Quran. He's never like he probably knew just bits and pieces of it, but like he memorized the whole Quran. Like imagine memorizing like the whole Bible, like word for word, you know, like so he's making the most out of his time. He's more fit than most men, like a third of his age. Like he's 67 years old and like is fully fit, you know, like working out, like I mean, like he's doing everything to keep him mentally, physically, and spiritually stimulated and strong. So inspiring.
Well, and if you think about it, he is surrounded potentially with a lot of people that have done a crime.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I send him my books?
So you can send him any book you want, but it definitely gets to be through the publisher. So you would get to order it through a publishing house, but there's so many rules. Like it can't be a hardcover because that could be considered a weapon.
Of course it could be. Yeah, of course.
In prison. And so you can't send food, you can't send anything. You could only send soft cover books. And that's pretty much it. Like we can't send him gifts or food or anything like that, you know. He could send gifts. He has like these websites where he'll buy my mom like purses, or like there's this flower. He'll order her flowers. Like my mom is in Jordan right now, and he ordered her, I think, like 500 different roses. You know, and she just finds it one day. And what a trooper she is. Like she's right now taking care of her mother in Jordan, and my brothers, being where they're at right now, have you know, so gratefully given the space to my mother for, you know, to support her while she's, you know, continuing the acts of service, which is so beautiful to witness. But you know, to be her, like that's a whole other, like I'm his daughter, but to be his wife, you know, for almost 20 years now, like to be without your husband, like I deeply, deeply sympathize with my mother, and like, you know, try as much as possible to be super compassionate, because to be where she is a whole other story.
Yeah, her partner is still alive, so he's still alive, but he's not physically there. It's the biggest screwing with your mind.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
In the documentary, which I recommend everyone watch, it's just so watch it and bring a barf bag because you'll feel sick to your stomach afterwards. It's on Al Jazeera World, and it's the Holy. Is it the Holy Land 5? And there's a part 1 and a part 2, 45 minutes each.
We can add the
right.
Yeah. I recommend people go and watch it because it was really well done. But I guess the question I have is, in that documentary, there was an individual that was also preparing to write a book. Is that book existing, or is it still being written, or what happened with that?
Yeah, there's actually multiple books that are being written. There was a book by Miko Peled, who actually is an Israeli-born citizen, Jewish, you know, Israeli, who wrote a book called A Soldier's Son, and literally about like his family being Israeli and coming from a long line of like military, and basically realizing at one point in his youth that like there are so many myths in that area, and now became like a huge advocate for the Holy Land 5 and their release. And so it's a beautiful perspective that will really help dismantle some of the occupation and oppression in that area, and that like that separation between Palestinians and Israelis, because you know that to me, like that illusion of separation, and really creating just a sense of oneness in that area is going to be ultimately what's going to like cause the walls around Palestine to fall and the walls around my father to fall simultaneously. But so he wrote a book, and then there's at least a couple other people, like a university professor and another university professor. Actually, one of my university professors at the New School was so moved by this case that she ended up like basically researching it, and like now she's in the midst of like writing a book about it, which is crazy.
Yeah. What wild. You know, I can't, I think of all the Netflix series that I've watched that I thought weren't even as contentious as what exists in your own life. And I can't understand why. And I kind of feel like I understand why, because the Muslim topic, it just isn't as appealing. There's something about like Islamophobia that you already alienate everyone that wants to vilify Muslims because of 9/11. So there's it's a harder sell at this point, and that's just stating it like no one can deny that there is a resentment that goes so deep that people can't see beyond it. Yeah.
Right. I'm such a walking oxymoron though, because like, you know, yes, I have this whole advocate Noor that is so embedded into who I am. And then I also have, you know, this whole other beautiful side to me of like, you know, I'm a DJ of electronic music. And I think we can definitely twist this in a very beautiful, sexy way. You know what I mean? And I'm all for it.
Yeah, I was gonna say you don't represent what one wouldn't look at your Facebook page and say, "Oh, that's a Muslim." There's no way that's what that's not the conclusion you'd come to.
Yeah, but they also wouldn't say that
typical, right?
They also wouldn't say that she's the daughter of a terrorist.
No, of course not.
Spending the last hour with you, there's so much loving.
Yeah,
right. Exactly.
Yeah, and you can tell. I mean, you can tell love comes from love. So the love and spaciousness that you've created, even towards what one might see as this aggressor, is a testament to how beautiful your father actually is.
Yeah. My BFF in New York, my husband, like everybody who truly knows me, they're like, wow, I thank your father every day because I can see him through you, and vice versa. And so, so much of it kind of is passed on, and people can feel it.
Well, I'm going to try to pronounce his name again, or you can pronounce it so I don't have to mess it up. Ghassan Elashi.
Ghassan Elashi, yeah.
Let's just say that in the history books, he'll be recognized as one of these individuals that took a stand against an authority, an oppressive authority, who wasn't able to see the beauty that he was embodying, just like Nelson Mandela. And,
absolutely.
And when that day happens, everyone will have to look in the mirror and say, where was I when this was going on? And why didn't I see that this is the society we'd become? And in a way, as an American, you know, I haven't lived there for many, many years, but I feel a lot of shame to see that this beacon on a hill that's supposed to be the democracy, which is supposed to be the basis for all other democracies, continues to show itself over and over again to me in ways that show that it is no different than anyone else that they're accusing of injustice. And this is an exact example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When people say America the Great, you know, I get slightly triggered because I do know that this is a like that this country has so much potential. And I know that, you know, my father would always talk about like, did you know that it was a crime for a black man to marry a white woman like maybe 60, 70 years ago? You know, and that was him. Like we grew up hearing like all these like facts, you know, and like, but now it isn't, you know, and now like multiracial marriages is you know, part of the norm. But like, you know, like there's so much like back and forth and like so many mistakes that we get to make as a collective and as a country in order to then like realize that like that was not the right thing to do. And this is going to be very much a part of that. And yes, he will be in history books, and there will be you know, reciprocity around this, and like some you know, public apologies, and you know, the truth will come out, because oppressive like any type of oppressive reality is not sustainable.
No,
it just isn't. Like, and it may take, you know, years, it may take decades, but ultimately the truth is revealed and justice is restored.
I think the truth has already been revealed, to be honest with you.
Right.
I just think that the individuals aren't ready to face the reality of their actions. Because
Right. And then just
yeah,
the collective mindset, that's where it
yeah,
starts. Like, again, going back to like writing your senators, is that what really is going to truly support like the freedom of people like my father is the collective mindset shifting,
yeah,
into really just realizing that like, you know, that people like him, they are just like us, and that there is no separation, and that he was a philanthropist and a humanitarian, and those were his only crimes. And when he got up to the mic on sentencing day, he basically says like, the only crime that you have against me is signing a check that will give people scholarships despite their circumstances, signing a check that will, feed hungry orphans, signing that check that will help somebody rebuild their home after it was bulldozed unjustly, and that was the greatest part of my life. And that was the most honorable part of my life, was to sign that check, and so to really, I think once the collective realizes that's all people in the Holy Land Foundation ever intended to do and ever did, like then we're going to start to see that paradigm shift.
yeah.
And it starts with exposure. It starts with discussions like this, and continues, because I've been doing this for over like a decade and a half at this point. But
and you mentioned like things that people can do. So outside of people listening who say, I have an incredible legal argument, or people writing their senators, what can people do to support and create more awareness around this? What activities, if any, are available to them?
at this point, it's like, it just has to be like being at the right place at the right time, knowing the right people. Like, I lived in New York for a decade, and that was my life, like turning the corner and meeting a person that would then open up this door and then open up that door. And that's what it's about, It's about like, yeah, like let's bring this into the mainstream. Let's do a Netflix series, let's um yeah, let's create a film about this, and let's make it, let's make it raw, and let's make it sexy, and like
Yeah.
So
Do we have
yeah.
Netflix?
Yeah, I do have a Netflix connection, so that might I'll talk to her next week, so that might be a
Nice.
nice avenue. Yeah. We've
Meditate too. Let's meditate for
yeah.
it. Collective meditation. I thought about doing like a world meditation for his release,
Mm,
yeah, it's going to take a national campaign, like
yeah.
an international campaign. It gets to be viral. It gets to, all the marketing experts out there. Anthony Iliano.
Yeah, he's
I
also
just
been here.
totally put him on the spot.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like, let's take this far and wide. Let's utilize our talents and our gifts to shed light on this, because anybody who hears about this story, anybody at all, pretty much like sees the huge monstrous injustice that has taken place, and feels very angry and wants to do something, to support. So
yeah, it's shocking to me that, not like, as I mentioned earlier, those two documentaries, which had such a profound impact on me, had such few views. Although they were polished, professional, put on
right.
national TV, they didn't have the traction I would have imagined just from such a
They
story.
did in the Middle East, like, so they were aired several times, like in the Middle East. But that's the thing; it was Al Jazeera English, so
Yeah.
we haven't quite done anything made by Americans, like designed and edited by Americans, like for the American audience. Like the only people who had like the inspiration to do something were people outside of this country, like there's a huge level of support in Europe and Latin America about this case. Like a lot of people know about this case.
Yeah.
And yet in the US, like I would absolutely love if there were, just any type of connections that would be interested and inspired to do something here.
Wow. We've gone over our hour, as I expected. Is there anything else you'd like to include before we close up? Is there anything that you'd like to say or
I just wanted to say, like, thank you, Andy and Bambo, for having me on and for creating this space to just share. And, you know, I may have not been the most eloquent because it's been a little bit nerve-wracking to come back into the realm of like being on the spotlight about this.
Yeah.
But there's a new sense of comfort and trust with this process that has washed over me, and I just appreciate the space to be able to share.
Yeah, when we spoke, I felt a deep humility that you trusted us to go through this with you, because I didn't know what I was asking you when I sent you that messenger post that just said, "Hey, you want to do a show?" You're like, "Andy, I don't know if you know what you're asking of me." That was kind of your response, which I really am grateful that you took the risk.
So you didn't have a story in mind?
No, I didn't know. I just knew that she had an injustice. I thought this would be a nice story. Let's have a short talk about it, And she's like, "Andy, you realize that I've been doing this for years, and that there's like a lot of, and even the bigger issue, which I also mentioned, and I'd like to, is that you are also being attacked by people who just want to vilify you because it allows their narrative to stay in order. So the way I see life is if you have truth, the way that you undermine truth is by attacking it, because that's the only way you can justify your beliefs. So it's a sad reality, is the more honest that Noor is, the clearer it is, the more that there will be strong resentment, because no one wants to believe this story, because then they have to admit to themselves that they were wrong, and no one wants to admit they're wrong. And that's the trouble in life, is that we make mistakes, but how willing are we to reflect and see, wow, maybe we reacted too quickly here? And that's what we're really asking people to reflect on, is how is it when there's a horrible event, 9/11, we all agree, no one actually is trying to, something totally disassociated with it is now collateral damage. Can we understand that that was the case?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, for society as a whole.
For society, yes, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Love you, Noor. Yeah,
thank you.
Love
you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, and we'll keep in contact if and when things come to our table because of this, because I'd love to see things emerge that are supportive and helpful. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for all your beautiful comments. Lily, Kevin, Anthony, Michelle. I recognize some of these names. Aja. Jackie. Yeah, so there's so much love, and just wanted to thank everybody who was present today, and all those who will watch this afterwards, and just share the video, and let's get this out there.
And obviously this will be edited down to a podcast.
Yeah, that'll be on a podcast as well. So I don't know if your dad has access to podcasts, but then he'll be able to hear it as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. If it's on the radio, he does, but otherwise, no.
Okay, not on internet. He doesn't hear it on the internet, for instance.
No, he'll hear it one day, though.
Oh, great. That we know. Thank you. A lot of love.
Okay. Lots of love.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And we forgot to mention today is the first day of Ramadan. So those that are celebrating Ramadan, it's just a coincidence that that's today. So we wish you a healthy and fasting. It's not going to be an easy month. I always know when I see my friends, my Muslim friends during this period, they're always irritable. and then every so often I'll just ask them, is it Ramadan or something? And then they'll say yes or no, but they know my implicit question. Well, it's beautiful to have that hour. How was it for you?
I'm processing. Jesus.
Yeah, I'm sweating a lot, actually. I noticed that when a subject comes on where I can feel it in my body, that my body really gets energetic, and you could see it in me today. I really had a hard time not feeling the frustration that comes up with this sort of injustice in the world. But I must say that on one side, I actually saw something unique that I didn't expect, was the admiration for this man. because it's these sort of men that change the world. And it's funny because it would be great to admire them in the moment that they're in those positions and not after they're gone.
Yeah.
So it's wonderful to celebrate him for actually representing something so beautiful and actually also exposing something which is horrendous, an injustice in a system that isn't actually able to manage it. Yeah. So thank you for joining us. It was a wild ride.
I have no words.
Yeah, I leave you with that. We love you all. Thank you for
See you
this
tomorrow.
time, and we'll see you tomorrow on
A wonderful
Chaos.